Great. Thank you everyone for coming out virtually tonight. I have a short introduction, which I'll work through as you guys are trickling in. I'm Gracie, I'm the events coordinator for print. A few housekeeping details before we start. If you have any questions during the event, please feel free to enter them in the chat box, which is at the bottom right, or in the question and answer function, which should be on the bottom of your screen. I'd like to thank Mechanics Hall for their partnership on this event. I believe we're about a year into our first Friday partnership with you guys. And though we're sad that we can't host it at the beautiful historic library, which is turning 160, we're so thankful for their partnership and promotion on these events and the ability just to bring all these authors to people everywhere. If you'd like a copy of Cross of Snow, we will include a link to the print page in the chat box. And now for our speakers. Kathleen Newman is the Manager of Education and Public Programs at the Maine Historical Society. Nicholas Basbanes is an award-winning investigative journalist and was literary editor of the Worcester Sunday Telegram. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Smithsonian. He's the author of 8 books, and he lives in Massachusetts. So please join me in virtually welcoming Kathleen Newman and Nicholas Basbanes.
Oh, wonderful. Well, here we are.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Gracie, and hi, Kathleen. Nice to see you here.
Nice to see you too, Nick.
Virtually, and I just want to begin by thanking the good people at print and independent bookstores around the United States for their support, not only of myself, thank you, but really for authors everywhere who have all of a sudden been faced with a whole new way of trying to market your books, you know, sell your books and meet the readers who matter so much. And I will hold up, if I may, you know, my book, here it is, Cross of Snow, I have a copy. And if you, I mean, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, and I take no credit for it. My editor, Vicki Wilson at Knopf, really was in charge of the design, and she went all out to produce a beautiful book. But it is one of these books that is really made to be seen in a bookstore. It's, you look at the striking cover and you say, pick me up, hold me, open me up. I mean, it's got wonderful deckled edge paper, gorgeous end sheets inside. And we've kind of lost that connection with the potential reader, and we've all had to go online virtually, and here we are. And I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak with some readers and to speak particularly with people in Maine, which is so essential to this book, is so essential to the life of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who regarded himself as a lifelong. He gloried in the knowledge that he was a son of New England, and particularly a son of Maine, which is celebrating its 200th anniversary this year. So how appropriate is that for me to have this book being published at this time? As a writer of, this is my 10th book, by the way, and as a writer of general nonfiction, so many things matter to me in the writing. Number one, fundamentally, is do you have a great story? You have a great story that you're confident that you can get, and also that you can tell it in a way that is good for the subject. In doing my research, of course, the material, the documentary material matters. That's 90%. But 10%, 15%, whatever the math is, the power of place. And when I think of this author, the power of place and also the power of materiality, when I think of authors in American history, I don't think there is any other author who can claim to have 2 absolutely magnificent historic homes that are national historic sites and that were so elemental in not only shaping the person that he became, but also in shaping the writer that captivated readers not only throughout the United States, but all over the world. His poems were translated into 30 languages. He was easily as popular in England as Alfred Lord Tennyson in his lifetime. In fact, he outsold Tennyson in England. He outsold Robert Browning. And of course, you don't want to just measure it strictly by sales, although sales are certainly important if you're a professional writer. But he was celebrated by all walks of life. He crossed all demographics. And just to point once more to the cover, because it is very important. You're looking at a photograph that was taken of Henry Longfellow in July of 1868. On July the 4th, 1868, in the morning, he was received by Queen Victoria in Windsor Castle. And she wrote in her diary that night, and she also wrote to the biographer of her late husband, Albert, how astounded she was when, after she had just received this famous American poet who was touring not only England, but Europe with his family. It was almost like a state visit. And as he was leaving, she noted that the domestic staff, the servants, were kind of hiding behind curtains or behind pillars, and they were all craning to get a look. And this, she found this very odd. Many people had visited and she'd received them, and she inquired later, and they all knew him. They all wanted to get a look at this great American poet whose work they knew and whose work they could quote. And when you think about a writer who had impacted, and we're talking about Great Britain now, not simply the United States. And may I say also that Longfellow is today still the only American to have a bust erected in his honor in Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner. So powerful was he. And that image that I showed you, that's the image of Longfellow, who is known best to the world as the white-bearded Longfellow. But when you think about the Longfellow that both of his wives knew and loved, he never had a beard. That beard comes after the death of his second wife, for reasons which many know. We'll get into it briefly a bit later. But the young, dashing, very handsome Longfellow, quite the clothes horse, by the way. And I have a number of images in the book of Henry growing up in Maine and in this magnificent house on Congress Street, which has been preserved. And I think, Kathleen, you told me this morning, I think I knew this, but I think we agree that this is probably the first established historic site in the United States for a writer. And
I've read in at least one publication that Henry's childhood home was the first American writer's home that was open to the public as a museum. It's certainly the oldest historic house in Maine, and it's a very special place for a lot of reasons.
And not only because it's the first, and it was the first house built in the Portland Peninsula, I guess, entirely of brick.
That's right.
By Peleg Wadsworth, Henry's maternal grandfather, who was a hero of the Revolutionary War. And by the way, my work in Maine, I think we discussed this morning in preparing for this, was not only spent a number of visits to the Wadsworth Longfellow House on Congress Street. I spent a good bit of time there. I think I met you, in fact, 5 years ago on my first trip up. By the way, my work in Maine, and it was a very informative trip. But not only did I do research there, but I spent a lot of time at Bowdoin College, where Henry, of course, was a student and later taught for 7 years. And I actually had a chance to visit Peleg's home in Hiram, Maine, which is privately owned. And that took a little bit of coordination to get in there and get a look at it. And so I've spent a lot of time up there. And you talk about the power of place. But when we talk about these two magnificent homes and how influential they are, and the other home, of course, being Longfellow House in Cambridge, Massachusetts at 105 Brattle Street, which is owned now and operated by the National Park Service as a National Park historic site. And, you know, as a writer, I use my words advisedly. I say that particular facility is unique in the American National Park system, because it's not the only house of a famous person that's maintained by the National Park Service, but it is also a major research center. They have calculated that they have 800,000 material artifacts, objects, documents, archival materials. They've got a full professional staff, as you people do also, the Maine Historical Society at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and they make these materials available to scholars. And I spent really, you know, the better part of 5 years, day after day, and I got to know the staff very well, day after day, week after week, month after month. After a point, it was year after year, just immersing myself in these materials. So much of which had not been accessed before. And to blend these in with the materials up in Maine, with the idea of not only creating a life of Henry, because and that is the subtitle, The Cross of Snow. We'll get to that a bit later, the significance of the title. But it is a life of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It doesn't claim to be the definitive biography, though I do go cradle to grave, but I do focus on the years, the formative years, which is the years in Maine his first marriage. You know, poor Mary Potter Storer Longfellow, who the first wife, who was so often lost on the margins. Henry graduated from Bowdoin College in 1825 at the age of 18. And then he was on the day of commencement, on the day, because it's in the records, you can go read the trustees' reports, as I have. The trustees met and they voted to create a position for the teaching of modern European languages at Bowdoin. And they recommended the appointment of young Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose father and grandfather were very, very prominent in the college. So his family was known. I guess we can acknowledge that perhaps there was a bit of legacy involved there, but he was brilliant. He graduated fourth in his class, in a class of 38, and a class that included Nathaniel Hawthorne. And when we talk about famous graduating classes, I don't care what college or university you have in the United States, you show me another college class that has produced two people in the same graduating class who could claim to be Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It's amazing. And they were across the board, they were high achievers. Horatio Bridge served in the cabinet of Abraham Lincoln. There were other people became judges, senators. It was an amazing class. And he was fourth and he was 18 years old. This is 1825. So, you know, almost 200 years ago. And a condition of this appointment to become the new professor of modern languages at Bowdoin, it would be the fourth college in the United States to teach these languages. It was a bequest from the widow of James Bowdoin III, for whom the college was named, to establish this chair. Henry would be required to go to Europe and learn the very languages he would be required to teach. Think about that. He couldn't speak them yet. Very few people could. And they were just kind of coming to the fact that these modern European Romance languages were something that were interesting and it should be taught in a college setting. So Henry set out at the age of 18, sailing to Europe, and he would spend 3 years there. And I describe this in my book. I call this chapter Awakening, and it is an awakening in many, many, many respects. You know, we think of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow as becoming this iconic, quintessential poet, really, of the 19th century. But he also can be argued to be our first multiculturalist, decades before that phrase was even introduced, because not only did he go to Europe and did he travel, and he kept these magnificent journals, and I photographed every page of every journal. I mean, these are not at the Longfellow House, these are at the Houghton Library at Harvard. So as many days as I spent at Longfellow House, I spent an equal amount over at Harvard going through the literary manuscripts and the thousands of letters that he wrote and that he received, and going through these journals. And thankfully, they allowed me to photograph them, so I was able to do my own transcriptions from his journals, which are quite magnificent. But he also drew these remarkable sketches of himself decked out in native garb. And so in Spain, you see him in, and I have these images in the book, he's dressed in Spanish-themed clothing, and he's on a horse, and he's on the road to Granada. He's quoting Lord Byron, pilgrimage, Childe Harold's pilgrimage, and when he gets to Italy, in France he's Henri. When he gets to Spain, he's Enrique. And when he gets to Italy, he's Enrico. And he even puts these little names on the side of the sketches. And at each of these places, he gets to know Washington Irving in Spain, and he mixes he gets to know the American legation, the ambassador. Alexander Everett. They fall in love with Henry. One thing you'll find about Longfellow throughout his life is it is impossible to find anyone who ever disliked him, who ever had an ill word to say about him. I mean, the one exception that would be Edgar Allan Poe, who never met him. Yeah. That we get into in the book, you know, had nothing to do with who he was. But that's a whole other story. But he was a delightful person. And when he leaves, and the correspondence has been preserved. And so there's not only the correspondence that Henry wrote and his second wife, Fanny Appleton Longfellow, wrote, and she wrote 812 remarkable letters, but the letters that he received, there are thousands, and I use that word, there are thousands of letters. Henry saved everything, and they are all at the Houghton Library. So I was able to read not only the letters that he wrote, but the letters that he received, and you can get a dialogue. And one of the earliest exchanges, in which I love, and I spent some time with it, was when he was an undergraduate student at Bowdoin, even before he went to Europe. And they're with his mother, Zilpha, because we talk about his grandfather, Peleg, who's justifiably famous. I mean, he was one of the pioneers, one of the leaders of establishing statehood for Maine in 1820. In recognition of his great service in the Revolution, he was presented with 7,500 acres of land out in Hiram, west of Portland, which I went to visit, and he lived there. Henry used to go and visit there, so it's very important. But on his father's side, Stephen Longfellow was a Harvard graduate, a prominent lawyer. His grandfather also was a very prominent person, a judge. There were 8 Stephens. And Henry is named for an uncle, Lieutenant Henry Wadsworth, who died in the Barbary Wars quite heroically. And there's such a poignant letter that Zilpha wrote, and which I got from the Maine Historical Society, incidentally, in which I quote, and it was a notice of when he died in Tripoli Harbor. It's so poignant, and he's buried in a nameless grave in Tripoli, thousands of miles away. And I guess his remains are still there. And so there has been even some thought of trying to get them back to the United States. I don't know where that stands. But she was a very, very bright, intelligent, well-read woman. And when you read the letters that she and Henry exchanged while he was at Bowdoin College, he's 16 years old. And there's a subtext going, and then there's an older brother, Stephen, who's problematic. And of course, she writes letters to her husband, who's serving a term in Congress, representing the state of Maine. She says, how could we have gone wrong? I mean, we have one son, we did everything right. And then Stephen was rusticated at Bowdoin, which means he was asked to take a leave of absence he was a very nice young man. Everybody liked him, but he kind of walked in the wild side. He was very friendly with Nathaniel Hawthorne, by the way. Hawthorne knew Stephen a lot better than he knew Henry. Henry and Hawthorne became very friendly in later life. And they kind of hung out at Ward's Tavern, which is very famous in the Lower Bowdoin College. But Henry was the perfect student. And Henry was asked by the parents, was required by his parents to report on his brother. And he found this very difficult thing to do. But he did it, and he said, I'm doing my duty, and I'm not happy about it. On the one hand, I'm squealing on my brother, but on the other, I have to do my duty. But while they're doing that, they are talking about poetry. He writes to her how he has just discovered Gray and Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, and it might be a little too obscure. And she writes back to him a magnificent, well thought out, considered answer. And I won't try to paraphrase it, but it's in the book. But when you see this dialogue that's going on between mother and son, it's the first of many relationships. So this is very important because it's the story of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And fundamentally, it's also the story of Fanny Appleton Longfellow, who he meets after the death of his first wife, and which really gives us our title, Cross of Snow. But he did fall in love with Mary, and of the letters of hers that survive, she also was a very well-read, intelligent woman, articulate, and it's been said he had a lapse in the writing of his poetry. He started writing poetry at a very young age. He entered Bowdoin at the age of 15, and by the time he arrived on the Brunswick campus, he was already a published poet. His first poem had appeared in one of the Portland newspapers with Battle of Lovell's Pond when he was 50 years old. And he had this knack for versifying. He had the temerity to want to be a professional writer, which nobody in America did. And he wrote to his father, I'm going to be graduating. What do you plan to make of me? I don't want to be a lawyer, he said. And I don't want to be a physician. I don't want to work in the dissecting room. I dream of eminence in literature, he says. And the father thinks about that. He said, well, unfortunately, I am not a man of wealth, and you do not have independent wealth. And it's really quite impossible for a person to make a living as a writer. I guess that was sensible advice in those days. And thankfully, when he got that offer from Bowdoin to get this professorship, it was remarkable. It changed his life. He took it in an instant, and he went off to Europe, and he spent those 3 years. And he learned 8 languages, and he met Washington Irving in Spain, and Irving impressed upon him, not only should you learn the languages of these countries, but you should learn and absorb the literatures of this country, of these countries, all the various countries. And one of the things Henry is really credited with, but which he doesn't get enough credit for, is introducing so many writers, foreign European writers, to American readers. German. When he becomes so proficient in German, he introduces no fewer than 50 German writers, including Goethe and Schiller, to American readers. Who translates the first American to do the first complete translation of Dante is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in the aftermath of the death of his second wife. It's something to do because he said, I can't do anything original at this point, and he turns to Dante. So there is so much about the state of Maine, as I said, the relationships with women are lifelong. And he quotes one of his Harvard lectures, and he says about Dante, he said, never once can you ever see him utter a single sarcasm against women. He's talking about Dante and, of course, Beatrice. And as I say in the book, well, you could pretty much say the same thing for Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Because not only, and what I try to profile in the book is not only how really desperately and dearly in love he is with both of his wives. And the death of Mary, and we're jumping ahead 10 years now, he returns from that 3 years, and he takes up his position at Bowdoin, and he teaches at Bowdoin for 7 years. He marries a local girl, Mary Storer Potter. She's the daughter of a local judge. And he's pretty prominent when General Lafayette visited Portland on the anniversary of the Revolution. I believe it was Stephen Longfellow who welcomed him, and little Mary Potter presented Lafayette with a bouquet of flowers. So they were a match. And you read the letter, he asks Judge Potter's permission for Mary's hand, and he just adores her. And I argue that I can really credit him with making two grievous errors, bad mistakes in his life. And the first one, I believe the worst, was really insisting that Mary travel with him to Europe on a second trip. Because his years at Bowdoin, and he was also the college librarian there. So not only as a condition of getting that professorship, he also agreed to be the college librarian. And he is credited with transforming the Bowdoin Library into a really very modern kind of a collection of secular materials, bringing in European titles. And I've read the catalog there. His entries are there, the books that he is responsible for bringing in. But he really, when he comes back from Europe, and he's in Maine, and he really is very eager, not that he dislikes Maine or that he has any animus towards Bowdoin, but it's down east. He writes a short story under a pseudonym, and he calls it Bunganuk. And of course, people who know Brunswick know there's a village of Bunganuk. And he said it is so far east, it's beyond the sunrise. And once he's trying to find another position, and he's looking everywhere, and he's not having any success. But then out of the woodwork, literally, magically, he's offered the position to have to assume the same position at Harvard College to replace George Tickner. But as a condition of that appointment, he now has to go and learn more languages, in particular German, which he didn't master so much. So his wife agrees to go to Europe with him. She doesn't want to go. We know she doesn't want to go. She's a frail young woman. And there's a letter from Stephen to Henry, and he said Mary doesn't want to go, and Henry's father doesn't want him to leave. He doesn't think teaching in Cambridge is going to be that much more successful in terms of money, but his mind is made up. He's going. And Mary goes with him, and we really don't know much about the pregnancy, really, until we learn that she has had a miscarriage. And that's the first time he writes home about it. Whether or not she recorded any of this in her journal, she kept a journal, one of the few things, and then I really, I'm disappointed in Henry in this, is that he destroyed her journal. When he was going to Europe in 1842, he burned her journal. One of her surviving sisters wanted to read the journal. He said, I burned it along with some letters. So we really don't know about the progress of the pregnancy. And she has the miscarriage, and she suffers for 5 weeks, and she dies in Holland at the age of 23. And he is devastated. He's grief-stricken. And he writes that poem, Voices of Angels and Voices of the Night, Footsteps of Angels and Voices of, and the visitation of, she comes and visits him, this spirit of his wife comes and sits with him lays her gentle hand in mine. And we mentioned this morning, in soft rebukes, she forgives him, but what is she rebuking him for? I don't know. Here we have to guess a little bit, but I believe he felt tremendous guilt about insisting that she go to Europe on that trip because it couldn't have been easy. And as a condition of going, she took two of her friends, and that's a whole other story that we write about. But as consumed with grief as he was, being a good Yankee and New Englander, he soldiered on and he continued with his studies, and finally he decided that he needed some air, and he went off on a trip through Germany, and just kind of so serendipitously, he runs into Frances Appleton, the daughter of Nathan Appleton, this remarkable young woman, brilliant in every respect. Her father was the founder of Lowell, Massachusetts, the textile city, and she has been exquisitely educated from the earliest of ages. This is a time when women really aren't educated formally. There are no colleges for them. Now, if you come from a very wealthy family, you are, on the other hand, educated by wonderful private tutors, and she was educated by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, George Barrow Emerson, the artist Frances Grader. She's tutored by Francis Lieber in languages. She's multilingual like Henry, and she's brilliant. And again, not only is he captivated by her, he is dazzled. And the first thing he says when he writes a letter, I met this woman in Switzerland, and he confesses he's fallen in love with her. And he said, she's not intelligent, she's a genius. She's a woman of genius. And it becomes a courtship, to use the word loosely, of 7 years, which really I write about. And the second greatest mistake he ever makes is to write a novel, a roman à clef, Hyperion, which is out of print, and it's too bad, but you can find it, Google it, it's online, get full text. It's very interesting. But he creates a character, Mary Ashburton, based on Fanny Appleton, and himself, Paul Fleming. And of course, he just talks about his rejection and his pursuit. And I guess he thinks this is going to make things right with Fanny. Well, you can imagine she's not happy at all. And it takes 7 years. Finally, however, for reasons I've never fully explained, there's a rapprochement, and she writes him a letter, which I print for the first time in General Madness. That's my first book, Cross of Snow. And for reasons when you see, it's very un-Victorian. It's passionate. And she says, yes, Henry, basically, I accept your marriage. Come to me. And he doesn't wait. He walks the 4 miles from Cambridge to Boston. He said, like an arrow. And he writes every year, May 10th, thereafter, oh, blessed day that ushered in this vita nuova, this new life of happiness. And then after, when Fanny dies, and we'll breeze over it a little bit here because I wanted to focus on the main connections. Fanny, of course, is the central female figure of the book. They have, once they are married in 1843, on July 13th, 1843, the reason that letter is so important is because it is her acceptance of him. And he, as I show, had what can be argued very persuasively was a nervous breakdown, and he was devastated. The rejection on the one hand and the grief from the first wife on the other. He had to go to Europe for 6 months to take the baths and to take a kind of a treatment. So that's when he comes back in 1842. He gets together with Fanny somehow, and they have an agreement, and they're married within 2 months. This ushers in 18 extraordinary years of creativity, and he really becomes the author of Hiawatha and Evangeline and Miles Standish and the Paul Revere's Ride and all the great, great poems. He spends close to 50 years living in this house, which was once Washington's headquarters. And then Fanny dies quite catastrophically, horribly, in a freak accident, a fire that takes place while she's sealing some lockets of her daughter Edith's golden hair. And these lockets survive, and you have little envelopes with Fanny's. You talk about how an object can really resonate. It's a little tiny envelope. And on 5 of these, she's written Edith's hair, July 1861. 4 of them have little golden lockets in them. 1 is empty. She was sealing these envelopes with a lighted candle and these crinoline dresses, which were just horrible things. Many, many, many women suffered horrible injuries and died, and she happened to be one of them. And this was in July of 1861, 3 months after the Civil War broke out. And then he writes in his journal, Act 2 of life's drama now ends. Now we begin Act 3. Act 1, apparently having been his life with Mary. Act 2, having been his life with Fanny. And now we have Act 3, which is the remainder of his life. And that's when he grows the beard and his celebrity only gets greater. He never gave up. He never gave up hope. He never despaired. He never asked why, how could this have happened? He had 5 young children. He took their care, and they became the focus of his life. In one letter, he writes George William Curtis, who wrote him a magnificent letter of condolence, and he said to the outside world, I am calm. He said, but inside I am bleeding to death. And then on the 18th anniversary of her death, they had been married 18 years. And on that evening, on the 18th anniversary, which happened to be just 2 days before their wedding anniversary, so she was buried on their 18th anniversary, he takes pen to paper and he writes this sonnet, The Cross of Snow. And it's a contemplation of 2 paintings, the painting, the very personal, private one in the bedroom on the 2nd floor of Craigie House, and the long sleepless watches of the night. The face of one long dead looks at me from the wall, where round its head the night lamp casts a halo of pale light. Here in this room she died, and never through martyrdom of fire sorry can books be read the legend of a soul more benedict. Those are the first 8 lines. And the next 6 lines, he makes the movement to this magnificent painting of a mountain in the distant west. There is a mountain in the distant west, recently been discovered. Thomas Moran painted it, and it displays a massive cross of snow on its side. And he says, such is the cross I wear upon my chest these 18 years, through all the changeless scenes and seasons, changeless since the day she died. And that was unpublished. He tucked it in a piece of paper. And I would never forget encountering this, going through the Harvard documents. Of course, as archivists, you know, these things come one off the top. You can't change the order. So you just run across it. And there's the Cross of Snow sonnet. And prudent Yankee that he is, 8 lines are on the front side of the sheet of paper and 6 lines are on the back. And he tucked it into a yellow envelope. And it was discovered after his death. It was so personal. But I regard it as one of the finest sonnets by an American, and I defy anyone who denigrates Longfellow's poetry to show me, to tell me of any American who writes a better sonnet than Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And I think I probably talked too long on that, and I want to invite my friend Kathleen to kind of come in at this point. And
no, I think that's I think everything that you said rings really true. I think that one of the things that I always talk about when we have guests in the Longfellow house is how that place is so special, you know, that the house and the city of Portland, this is where he grew up, and it's where he learned how to be a writer. It's where his very first poetry came from.
You have the desk where he wrote his.
That's right. Yeah, we have you know, the table where we think he wrote, you know, his very first published poem on, and the house. Even after he grew up and moved away, he came back and visited the home all his life. His sister Anne lived there. She was the last person to live there, and she lived there until she died in 1901. And Henry, I think, spent much of his last summer there in 1881.
Footsteps of Angels there.
Yes, yeah.
He writes in his journal, I quoted in the book, and he can't sleep. And you know, when you think of Footsteps of Angels, again, it's during a sleepless night. He can't sleep. And I never really realized that you jump ahead from 1839 to 1879, 40 years difference. Again, it's sleepless nights, and he's seeing these beloved women in his life. But when he's in the house in Portland and he's writing and he can't sleep and it's raining, and he calls it's a very Christian rain. It's very quiet. It's the patter. And he said, and this is when the spirits and the ghosts come out. This is while he's in that house.
Yes, it was. I mean, it was always a source of inspiration to him his whole life. His poem, Haunted Houses. He never says, you know, I wrote Haunted Houses about my childhood home, but he wrote it not long after his parents died. And he mentions in that poem, you know, all houses wherein men have lived and died are haunted houses. It's a great poem. And he goes on to describe a place that's full of these very palpable memories, you know, a place that's not spooky haunted, a place that's full of the memories of the people that he loved. So I always try to remind, our visitors how lucky we are that we still have this setting, the home, and to a large extent too, the city that inspired the words of the man who was, for a long time, the most famous English language writer in the world.
Undisputed.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any question about it. And when you think of how he fell out of favor in the 20th century, and that was another reason why I wanted to write this book, by the way, because I was just angry. I was angry because people never, they say he fell out of favor. People stopped reading him. That's not true.
Yeah.
That's not true. People love his poetry. And I realized this on the occasion of his bicentennial in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
Really, when I decided to do this book, I did a piece for Smithsonian Magazine observing his bicentennial. And there was an exhibition at the Houghton Library, which was one of the best attended exhibitions they ever had. And also the Library of America in the year 2000 published the 100th book in its series. And they're now up to 330 books of the American literary canon. So Longfellow, they finally got to him after 100 authors. And yet, I just recently asked for the sales figures. He ranks 28th out of 330, So yeah, he's behind Emily Dickinson, I guess, and he's behind Thomas Jefferson, who's in the series. But he's ahead of Jack Kerouac, go figure that, and a few others. And he's quite interestingly positioned, but it's a good, strong, steady seller over a period of 20 years. Who's buying that book? People who love his poetry. And when you hear people say the patter of little feet or ships that pass in the night.
Ships that pass in the night.
And there are dozens of examples.
Into every life a little rain must fall.
Used every day, and people don't even know because they're quoting wrong.
I think that now, we were saying earlier that, so many people are reading more now than maybe they were 4 or 5 months ago. And what a great time if you're not familiar with Henry's poetry to kind of discover it, or if you remember it from a time in your life but you haven't read it recently, a good time to rediscover it. He's, when he's grouped with other writers of his era, I think he's oftentimes referred to as, the fireside poets, because his poetry, a lot of it was meant to be, read, kind of like you would curl up with a good book on a rainy day. You can curl up with Henry's poetry.
It's a wonderful thing. I know that I pick up his book. They just demand to be read out loud.
Yeah. Yes.
They're so easy to read. He was a master of, people don't realize how brilliant he was. Yes, he did import European models. That's one of the raps against him. He imported these European, there isn't a form of poetry that he didn't use, dactylic hexameters.
Sure.
The sonnet, he followed the sonnet form. Hexameters, that was only supposed to be used for epic poems, but he did it with Evangeline, he did it again with Miles Standish. And they loved it. They said he was advised against doing it, but he did it. He was a master of form. And when you read some of these poems, it's one of the great things about the Dante translation, why it is still respected today and considered one of the best, is because of its fidelity to the original. How he tried to preserve Dante's original poetry structure and the authenticity of his language. So it's a remarkable. People value it so much because of its fidelity in the original. But as you say, you pick up one of those poems and you just read it. Even people will mock, Hiawatha, and they'll say on the shores of Gitche-Gumee. Okay, so maybe that brings a smile. But just read that opening canto, and the chiefs and the spirit calls the tribes of the nation to come and gather. And he said, and of course you say it's about, early indigenous people, which it is, and it was based on Schoolcraft's works. But he was talking at a time, when disunion was really we were in the years leading up to the Civil War. People say, well, he really didn't engage himself in what was going. He did, but he did it in his own way.
He did it in his poetry,
He says to the tribes, he said, your worst thing you can do is disunion. Your strength is in your union. And when he writes that poem, The Building of the Ship.
Building of the Ship.
And
Yep.
he inserts that stanza, the final few lines, sail on, O ship of state. You know, he's talking about, you know, this is the imminence of the Civil War. He's saying, sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union strong and great.
I think it
brings tears to the eyes of Abraham Lincoln when it's read to him.
I think too, you know, Paul Revere can be read too as a moment where he's hearkening back into a moment in American history, you know, with something like 80 years prior, to call his own countrymen to say, you know, what this is about to happen again, you know, that we're on the edge of war again. That call is gonna come. Are you gonna be ready?
I argue exactly what that.
Yes. Are you gonna be ready the way our grandfathers were? You know, when that call comes in the middle of the night. So I know that we're getting a couple of questions from the participants in the chat feature, and one of them is. When you're doing such deep research, do you find it hard to leave the subject once you've finished the book?
Yeah, I do. I fall in love with my material. I wrote a column about it for a magazine recently. It's happened with every book. I mean, I actually was interviewing a psychiatrist once and he said, you know, the problem with you is you fall in love with your research. It comes a point you have to go home and write.
You have to stop. Yeah.
And I call that moment my Haskell Norman moment, because that's the person I interviewed. And so it's that point when I finally say to myself, you know, Nick, it's time to go home and write. This book, I tell you, the 19th century is just a place to be. And I hope the next book stays in the 19th century. These are the last people who documented their lives, wrote magnificent letters, magnificent journals, and they received wonderful letters. And I was able, because I'm one of these writers that wants to let people speak for themselves. I want to hear their voices. I want you to know Fanny. I want you to know Henry. I want you to know Mary as well as I can give her a character, personalize her. And I'm able to do that because they wrote such beautiful letters. You really can hear their voices and hear them speak. And I try to arrange it in a way that would take the shape of a dual narrative. And when you meet Fanny for the first time, I want you to meet the young woman he meets in Switzerland. I want you to see her in all her glory. It's almost like Athena-like. And then I go back to profile how she becomes the woman that dazzles everyone she meets with her intelligence, with her wit. She's absolutely charismatic. I don't want to get. People say you fell in love with Fanny. I did. My wife said I'm competing with Fanny. Yeah, she was one of those cases. I walk into those instances every time I walk into that house. And it must happen at the Wadsworth Well, as you walk in, and you're transported back.
Yes,
George Washington lived there for 9 months during
that's right, the house in Cambridge.
So it's not only this iconic 19th century house, it's an iconic 18th
century house, yeah.
And one actually kind of prefigures what happens in the next, because Longfellow was ever mindful of the fact that this was Washington's.
Oh yeah, that meant a lot to him.
So much, and you see Washington in every room in that house.
That's right.
And you see him in your house. Your
That's right. Yeah, it's there's an engraving of George Washington that's hanging over the fireplace in the parlor.
He actually had a snippet of was it Washington's hair, a lock of it's maybe.
Yes. So the engraving of Washington that's at the Wadsworth Longfellow house supposedly has been hanging there since 1802, which means Henry's grandparents would have had it put there. And one of Henry's aunts, his aunt Elizabeth Wadsworth, when George Washington died, she asked her father, Henry's grandfather, Peleg Wadsworth, for a lock of Washington's hair to remember him by. And he made the request to Martha Washington, and she obliged, sending a lock of her late husband's hair to Portland, Maine. And Elizabeth died just a couple years after that happened. She was young. She was like 22 or 23 when she died, and she left the hair to Zilpah, Henry's mother, sort of with the hope and with the caveat that, you know, she said, this heirloom should stay in the family for as long as they can keep it. But, you know, maybe someday, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but maybe someday Maine will be its own state, and maybe there will be an institution that preserves Maine history, and it could go to a place like that. So it gets passed on in the family. It gets passed on to Henry, and then to one of his daughters, and she left it to Maine Historical Society.
And Longfellow here. So that poem that I mentioned, you know, Footsteps of Angels, it's a tribute to his wife, but it's also a tribute to her husband. She became a widow also at the age of 23.
She, his
lived
sister
in
Anne.
Homestead for the next 60 years for the remainder of her life.
Yeah.
And when she passed away, she insisted that this house go to the Historical Society.
That's right. Yeah.
That's why your society is really.
That's why we are where we are. Yeah.
Right on the premises.
That's right. Now, what did you find? Here's another question. The biggest challenge in writing about Henry Longfellow's life?
How to decide what not to use. It's just
There's so much
of wonderful information, and that's where it really helps to have a great editor, because she kind of puts it. We love it, but you know.
But you can't do it all.
Can't use it all. But I find I have a little trick. I hope she's not watching right now. But, I take stuff out and I kind of insert it in long end notes. So
Yes.
some of that material, I don't lose it. And I really encourage people to read the end notes, because I love discursive end notes. Nice little stories, little essays unto themselves.
Nice.
And I think that's what a printed book can do today, you know, that the electronic alternative can't do. I think you try and find ways, because you can get this, and I hope people who like the Kindle will get the Kindle, but I really hope they'll get the printed book.
Sure.
It's beautiful and really wonderful to hold. But there are things there that really suited for a printed book. Notes, and I like the epigraphs. I use epigraphs, these little quotations before every chapter. I try to make them a performance unto themselves, where they tell little stories that aren't necessarily in the body of the chapter, but they illumine what the chapter is. And that's kind of a thing that works better, I think, in a printed book than it would in an electronic book. But I guess the hardest part was what do you leave out?
What do you not talk about? Yeah. Now, someone says that they can remember when they were working at a bookstore, a customer came in, an English woman, and she said she was shocked that people in America didn't know much about Longfellow anymore, but that in England he was still very well known, probably better known than he is here. Why is that?
Well, why is he in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey? And you know, poetry is this great English institution. They have the poet laureates, and they have this tradition of respecting great poetry, and he is in that tradition. We have a Longfellow Society scholars, and it's growing, and we have a number of very eminent scholars who are from the UK, and they say the same thing. I've been to a few of these meetings.
Yeah. So it's just more of a tradition of poetry in general.
They know what he's doing too. I mean, they know these aren't just words that rhyme. I mean, he is really writing and crafting poetry in a very ingenious, technical way, but also writing poetry that people can. Teddy Roosevelt wrote a letter, and Longfellow was kind of falling out of favor, and he just begged this critic for the Atlantic Monthly, please, he said, don't forget Longfellow. He is so good. And when he describes a certain poem, he said, I can hear the clash of the oars and the sound of this. And everything just comes alive. And he really does make these wonderful word images. And he is, as you say, he really is meant to be read aloud. And you just pick up the rhythms. You know, Hiawatha, there's this tom-tom. Paul Revere's right. It's like hoofbeats throughout.
Yes, yeah.
This is not by chance, you know.
This is by design.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thanks Nick for this conversation, for this time, and I think the audience, and myself included, are really excited to read the book. Thank you, Print, for hosting, and for Mechanics Hall. For putting on this event. I don't know if any of you out there that are listening, like Nick, have had a chance to visit Henry's childhood home in Portland. Right now, out of an abundance of caution, the house remains closed, at least through the end of August this year, and come the fall, we'll reassess and revisit. Hopefully we can open it back up again soon, but again, right now the priorities are the safety of our staff, our guests, and of the precious collections there. But you can visit, if you visit, Maine Historical Society has a website, hwlongfellow.org, where we have a poetry database of all his poetry, and where you can learn more about Henry's life. And if you visit our website, mainhistory.org, you can download a free app for your smartphone where you can visit Henry's house virtually. You can see images and hear a virtual tour or read text, learn more about some of the objects in the house. So we hope that you'll visit us virtually until you can visit us in person again. So thank you again, Nick. Thank you, Mechanics Hall. Thank you, Print. I don't know if our hosts from Mechanics Hall or Print have anything else they'd like to end on, but thanks so much, everyone, for having us and for joining us.
I just second that entirely. Thank you all.